Each year around the March time, we have a new version of the BIZBOK guide being released. And this year also, we had version 13 of the BIZBOK guide that was released in March of 2024. And once the new version is released, we look at the changes in the latest version, and we actually identify those changes using one of the business architecture techniques, that's heat mapping. So heat mapping is a typical way that we identify where we see the change and also the amount of change that we see across the organization as a result of executing a business strategy or perhaps going through a business or digital transformation. So what you see here is the table of contents of the BIZBOK guide, and the heat mapping that we applied here has the green color indicating that there has been no changes in that specific part or section of the BIZBOK guide. Yellow color indicates minor changes in the parts or the section of the guide. Then we have the moderate changes that are identified by the amber or the orange color. And finally, major changes that are indicated by the red color. And overall, in this version of the guide, we haven't really seen major changes. It's been kind of a light update of the BIZBOK guide, but let's get into that. Let's look at each part and each section and identify where we see those changes and kind of talk about what are the changes that we have seen in the latest version. In part 1, there hasn't been any changes. In part 2, we see a variety of minor and moderate changes. Specifically in the strategy mapping, that's section 2.1, we see a few changes. One is the addition of the definitions for different elements in the strategy domain, things such as goals, objectives, course of action, change, and so on. And also the emphasis on the relationship between product entitlement and value streams. The fact that through the delivery of the value in value streams, we also deliver the product entitlements, and that relates to the customer services around delivery of a product, and also a topic that we'll cover in the product mapping. There's also an emphasis on the concept of change, which is quite important, especially in the strategy mapping. You might have been experiencing, in practice, when you are looking at the impact of a strategy, we actually identify the change and the impact of the change that the strategy has across the organization. So change is an important concept to think about and to focus on when we are looking at the strategy mapping and also identifying the impact of executing a business strategy. There are a couple of changes in the Metamodel. One is the objective decomposition, and the other one also course of action decomposition. So in the previous version, we didn't have the decomposition of these two elements, and now it's been added in version 13 of the BIZBOK guide. So a few other changes that I'll quickly walk through. Under capabilities, there are minor changes in the principles section of the capabilities. Under organization, there's also the change in the objective decomposition Metamodel. That's also part of the organization Metamodel. And then we have the value streams. That's also looking at the changes in the steps that we go through in order to build and design value streams using these templates that are in the BIZBOK guide. And also the other minor change that we see in the value streams is the use of the stakeholder category. Again, under the stakeholder mapping, we're going to talk about the stakeholder category, but when we do value stream design, we map the triggering and also participating stakeholders to value stream and also to each stage of a value stream. And so in the latest version of the guide, now we are highlighting the fact that we could leverage a stakeholder category in order to identify the triggering and participating stakeholders. And there are a set of guidelines that in which cases we are allowed to use stakeholder category as opposed to specific stakeholders. And then under the information mapping, we also have a minor change on the relationship mappings for information concepts when we actually map different information concepts to each other. And there has been some minor updates around the guidelines of how we actually identify these relationships among information concepts in our information map. And the other minor update that we see is the removal of the relationship between a stakeholder and information concept, and then replacing that with the relationship of a stakeholder category to information concept. So a stakeholder category is represented as an information concept in the information map. Again, we're going to touch on that again in the stakeholder mapping section. And then moving on to section 2.6, that's initiative mapping. We see some moderate changes here, specifically under the guidelines. So we could identify candidate list of initiatives, and that's actually great to see in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide, because that's indeed happens in practice. When we are involved as part of defining initiatives, we can actually identify those candidate lists of initiatives based on the assessments and analysis that we do in that specific context. Again, the context could be executing a strategy, a business transformation, any type of a change or different scenarios that we are involved in. And it's actually great to see that, because that kind of elevates the value of business architecture upstream, where we are connecting up into the strategy and then defining the initiatives before we get downstream into the execution of those initiatives. And that in fact aligns also to the third item, which is about prioritization and triaging of our portfolio of initiatives, which is also another important role that we could play before we get into the actual execution phase. So it's really great to see that we are putting more and more emphasis and focus on the true value of business architecture in the end-to-end strategy to execution framework. There's also a minor update on the mapping of initiatives to value stream stages, and then leveraging that to identify the capabilities that are being impacted in the scope of that initiative. And then looking at the product mapping, so there has been also some moderate changes in this section of the BIZBOK guide. One is around the mapping templates and guidelines. So there has been few new templates that's been added under product mapping along with the relevant guidelines, and also identifying the product mapping team. So in the governance section of the BIZBOK guide, we talk about the Business Architecture Center of Excellence. And that's one way of structuring business architecture team in a form of a center of excellence, that we have a core set of participants. Those are typically the business architects that supports the practice, and then the establishment of the knowledge base and managing the repository of the information on business architecture and different domains. But we also have the virtual participants as another element of the Center of Excellence. And the virtual participants are those typically the SMEs across the organization that can support the building, the design, and the analysis of different domains of business architecture. And so in this case, we leverage the product-related expertise across the organization in order to build the product mapping team. So product managers, product strategists, perhaps some account managers, there are typical roles that we might bring in order to do the product mapping. The other update that we see in the product mapping is the focus on the product entitlement. So in the previous versions, we of course had the concept of product entitlement, but in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide, we are putting more emphasis on the role of product entitlement when it relates to, of course, the product, but also to capabilities, to value streams, and how we can actually deliver product entitlement through value streams and also leveraging a set of business capabilities. So there are a set of guidelines around the formulation of product entitlements from the lens of the recipient of those entitlements, and also guidelines around how we can cross-map business capabilities to a set of product entitlements, which then rolls up to the mapping of capabilities to the product that goes with those set of entitlements, and also a set of guidelines around the cross mapping to the value streams, because again we deliver the product entitlements through different value streams. And product entitlement element is closely aligned to the concept of customer service in the day-to-day operations of the business. So looking at section 2.8, that's stakeholder mapping. A few definitions has been added at the beginning of this section on different elements of a stakeholder domain, and also the clarifications on the stakeholder category element. And that's actually really great to see, because in previous versions we'd had some ambiguities and the confusions around the stakeholder category and also the relationship of a stakeholder to a stakeholder category and also to the rest of the domains of business architecture. And that's all been clarified in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide. So that's really great to see. So a stakeholder category, now we have a formal definition of a stakeholder category. And so, by the way, stakeholder category, it's referring to the three specific categories. That's human resources, that could be either internal or external stakeholders. And then we have the partners and customers. So these are the three categories of a stakeholder: human resource, partner, and customer. And you do find a clear definition of all of these now in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide. So along with the stakeholder category, now we see the relationship to the stakeholder, and that's classifies as a relationship. So a stakeholder category classifies different stakeholders into, again, three different categories: human resource, partner, customer. And also the cross mappings to capabilities, value streams, and information concepts. So for each category of a stakeholder, we have a corresponding capability in our capability map. When we have human resource as a category of a stakeholder, we have a human resource management in our capability map. Where we have partner as a stakeholder category, we have partner management in our capability map. Where we have customer as a stakeholder category, we have customer management as a capability in our capability map. And so that's the cross mapping to the capabilities. But the cross mapping to value streams, as I talked about in our value stream section, is that where we identify the triggering and participating stakeholders across a value stream, we can also leverage a stakeholder category as opposed to referring to the specific stakeholders. So instead of referring to the specific customers, for instance, we can just use the category customer to identify the triggering or the participating stakeholders. But of course, there are a few guidelines on where we are allowed to leverage the category as opposed to the specific stakeholders when we are mapping to the value streams, either as triggering or participating stakeholders. And finally, information concepts. That's also great to see. So previously, we were referring to a stakeholder defines information concept, which was really not clear enough. But now in the latest version, we have a very clear relationship. So a stakeholder category is represented as information concepts. And that's actually how we leverage that in practice as well. So again, where we have customer, partner, human resource as a stakeholder category, all these three categories are also information concepts. They are represented as information concepts in our information map. So we have human resource, we have partner, we have customer as information concepts in our information map. So now we have very clear definition and the understanding of how a stakeholder domain maps to capabilities, value streams, and information domains. Now, looking at the policies, we just see some minor changes here, and that's mainly around the mapping guidelines and also the fact that now we do have the objective decomposition in our meta model, which is part of the policy meta model as well. So these are a few changes that we see in the part 2 of the BIZBOK guide, and that's all around the core and extended domains of business architecture. And a very important part of BIZBOK guide, by the way, right? That's really builds our knowledge base of business architecture, and anything else we do, we leverage that knowledge base for different analysis and assessments and different engagements that we have with the business. Looking at part 3, that's where we have the practice conversation and also the alignment of business architecture with other business disciplines. So here we really don't see much changes other than some minor changes in the business model section. So now in the key partners section of the business model canvas, we have also added the mapping to the organization, because the partners also could be a third-party partner or a supplier or a vendor that's actually could be in the organization mapping. And that's why we have added organization domain as one of the domains that we map in the key partners of the business model canvas. The other section that we have some moderate changes is the performance management and the alignment of business architecture and performance management. So one is to leverage business architecture to prioritize different investments and initiatives. We did touch on that a bit under the initiatives mapping, but we can also leverage the metrics and the performance measurement that we use as an input into the prioritization of different initiatives and investments in the organization. Again, it's really great to see this point added in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide, because that's also elevates the value of business architecture supporting the investments and portfolio planning for the whole organization. And there has also been few adjustments into the 4 main metrics that we use for performance measurement. Those are the effectiveness, and that's referred to the heat mapping that we do on a set of capabilities or value stream stages, and the breadth of coverage. So how broadly a capability is leveraged in a specific context. The context could be a value stream stages across our value streams, looking at different organization and business units, and product as well. That's also another context. You know, how broadly a capability used to enable our portfolio of product and the product entitlements. So that's one way of identifying the breadth of the coverage of a business capability, which is one of the metrics that we would leverage to identify the performance of the business. And finally, the automation, which identifies the level of automation of a business capability. So those are a few of the moderate changes that we see in the section 3.7 or performance measurement. And then under section 3.0 or requirements, we just see a minor change in the Metamodel under this section, and that's the decomposition of objective and also initiative. So those 2 decompositions also been added in the business architecture Metamodel. The rest of the sections, we see no changes. Moving to part 4 or scenarios also, there hasn't been any changes. Under part 5 or infrastructure section, where we have section 5.1 or knowledge base, we also identify the meta model of business architecture. So all of the changes we talked about throughout the rest of these sections, you know, on the objective decomposition, on the changes between the stakeholder and the information concept mapping, and the initiative decomposition, course of action decompositions. All of these changes that we have seen so far is being reflected also in section 5.1 under the Metamodel section. And then moving to part 6, that's the alignment of business architecture with IT architecture. Overall hasn't been changes other than section 6.5 or SOA, which is just a minor change, and there is a benefit that's been added under this section, and to put more emphasis on the fact that when we leverage business object-based capabilities to define the services in the SOA environment, we have a much better alignment with the business strategies, the goals and objectives, and how we actually leverage business architecture to identify the services in our service-oriented architecture environment. And part 7 or case studies, we see no changes. And under part 8 or reference models, so in every update of the BIZBOK guide, we see quite moderate changes across all of the reference models in the BIZBOK guide. But specifically in version 13, we also see a change in one of the reference models that used to be called member-based organization, and now we call that an international development organization. And that's referring to kind of expanding the scope of the reference model to refer to typically mission-based organizations. You can think of the UN type of organizations or NGOs, and kind of expanding that reference model to cover these types of organizations, which is really not covered in the rest of the reference models, because there is a bit of a difference in the operations and the type of operations that these kind of mission-based organizations have. One, of course, the difference is that the concept of customer is now more so the beneficiary of that organization. So you do see, when you look at this reference model, you do see those changes reflected in the reference model. And finally, you can always look at the Appendix D. The link is at the bottom of this video, so you can that's publicly available, by the way. You don't need to be the member of the guild, that you can actually look at the version history of all these changes in the latest version of the BIZBOK guide. And there's also a link to an interactive model, Metamodel, that we have created here at Arcase. That's all of the metamodels and the relationships, specifically in the core and extended domains, along with few of the other elements. You see the business processes, you see the CX design, you see some of the IT architecture components. Few of these, we have actually created an interactive Metamodel that you can actually pick and choose which of these domains you are interested to see the relationships and the metamodels from the BIZBOK perspective. So that's actually an interesting one to check out. And instead of going back to BIZBOK and trying to figure out those static metamodel views, here you see an interactive one that you can quickly look at different relationships among the domains that you are interested to find out, the relationships. And finally, this heat map is for information only and purely reflects our view of the latest changes in the BIZBOK guide. So I hope you enjoyed this quick update on the latest changes in version 13 of the BIZBOK guide.